really awesome.
As we settle down, really thanks to the litigation and enforcement panel. That was a great panel, and it's really relevant, right? When you're talking about FDA, you're talking about compliance, all those things. Remember what you learned in that first panel. We're the regulatory team at Gardner Law. We're going to shortly introduce ourselves, but just wanted to give you a clue of what we're talking about is a changing FDA, leveraging what we've learned, how to apply it to the future, right? When you think about FDA-regulated product getting on market, whether it's a medical device, a pharmaceutical, that takes years, right? And when you're talking about years, you don't have the privilege of adapting month to month, right? That can pretty much burn out all the capital you might have. And so really understanding what the playing field that you're trying to enter onto is and trying to be as creative as well as predictive as you can is important in this space. I'm Nathan Downing. I'm on the regulatory team with my colleagues here who will introduce themselves. I've been with Gardner for 5.5 years. Really enjoy the work, really get to see a lot of unique products, a lot of unique ideas, help clients bring those to market, but there's also post-market concerns, a lot of different things that come with our work that is really enjoyable. So we'll let each person introduce themselves.
Okay, well, these fine folks. I have been at Gardner Law for about in advertising and promotional and the advertising and promotional space. So we work with teams regularly on making sure pieces are compliant.
My name is Darya Lucas, and I'm also in the firm's regulatory group, as I said. I assist with submissions. I assist with ad promo reviews. I also dabble in compliance and help our compliance group a bit. So I've been with Gardner for almost 2 years. I'll have my anniversary next month. So.
And I am Brynn Stanley. I've been with Gardner Law for about 6 years. Prior to that, I worked in various quality roles at several medical device companies around the Twin Cities. I am an engineer by trade and also an attorney, but I am on the regulatory team. I primarily focus on kind of like all aspects of regulatory, but my kind of bread and butter are kind of quality issues, risk management, post-market surveillance, and then I do a lot of work with firms on their clinical trials as well.
Thank you. Yeah, we have a great team with varied experiences, varied skill sets, and it's been a pleasure the last 2 years. As you can see, our agenda here, we've already introduced ourselves, so we're good there. But we are going to start off with a bit of an FDA update that kind of sets the stage. Then this is really a panel conversation. As part of that conversation, we invite questions in real time as they come up, and we'll answer them as best we can. If it's too specific, always we'll have to punt on that. But I'm certainly looking to see all of our experience, right? Some of the best conversations I have in these meetings are where other people's experiences are brought in, because everyone in industry can learn from each other and kind of grow as we adapt to a changing FDA. And then we'll still have time for questions as well from the audience. So we'll make sure we hold time if you're a little bit shy of interrupting. So the past year at FDA, year and a half, has been interesting if you work with FDA. And I think when you look at change and you look at different individuals, you look at different skill sets, that can create challenges. So what just happened a couple of days ago, right? Dr. Macri, he is no longer at FDA, right? And so with that and the initiatives that he was leading, is there a question mark? And I think that you look right now, there's an acting, I had to write down the name, Kyle Diamantis is the acting director. And I think it was yesterday that FDA announced and HHS announced that they'll be doing a full search for a replacement. And so that tells you that, yep, the acting director will be short or long, right? Depends on the process and the confirmation that's required. But the individual currently leading the FDA doesn't really have a lot of medical experience. They came from private practice. They were at Jones Day. They actually did some defense work on infant formula, which is interesting because certainly FDA experience there, but not what you would typically see in an FDA commissioner. So I think that that's interesting. If it's going to be short term, it might not be that impactful, but it's still something to watch. That individual, Kyle, came from a food focus, right? He was leading FDA's food center and focused on some of the MAHA considerations, and so certainly has been at the center for a little while. I work a lot with CDRH. We work a lot with CDRH, and I will note that Dr. Michelle Tarver is still the lead at CDRH and has been from the previous administration. Actually, she was in Minnesota a few weeks ago. If you're at the Medical Alley event, I was at that. It was really great to hear her. I do appreciate the consistency that she brings. I think it gives a little bit of comfort, though. Even Dr. Tarver will acknowledge there's some shortcomings with just the resource load and some of the loss of knowledge they have, right? So great leadership update to provide for CDRH because it's nice to hear consistency. CBER, this is another acting leader, Dr. Sarama. I had to look it up online today to make sure I was saying it right. She's May 1st appointed, right? So this is very new. This is another acting. Dr. Prasad, who was there before, was there, left, came back. So a little bit of uncertainty when you're looking at CBER. Obviously, they control vaccines, biologics, the approval process for those. And so something to watch if you're in that space. And then Dr. Hogue is an acting director at CDER as well, a physician, didn't have regulatory experience, but certainly has the scientific chops. And so at those agencies, at those centers, I should say, there's a lot of different issues that they're facing, right? CDER and CBER, loss of talent, CDRH. You'll see it sometimes in the way that they respond to things. You won't get as full of a response, or you'll get what I might deem a deficient response from FDA as, hey, they're telling me there's an issue with this. I don't really see the issue. And to me, reading between the lines is the issue is you didn't have the time to maybe look at the full submission or the time to look at our answer. And so, when you see those kind of considerations and you see that with leadership updates and some of the firing and the rehiring that occurred, it is a tumultuous time at FDA. And I think it's important to acknowledge that when you are going to be in front of something, you need to know that you may not be dealing with the expert that was there 2 years ago who had been there for 20 years. Anything to add on that?
I'll add to that. So our team in March went to MDMA and we got to hear from a lot of FDA staff, and it was very clear to us that the times right now are more volatile, that it weighed heavy on them. They're still trying to meet their timelines, but we could see amongst the staff that that some of them mentioned that timelines are getting tougher, and so that volatility, I think that there might be more of that on the horizon potentially.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So, one thing when you're working with an agency, you're often interested most in what are they focusing on, right? Because what the FDA focuses on is what you should focus on, especially from an enforcement standpoint. I think one thing that stands out is advertising, especially DTC advertising. Rebecca's probably going to touch on this in a little bit, but I will note that that is a major area of enforcement right now, right? And so when you are putting your advertising out into social media, it's clearly discoverable if there are AI bots trolling, right? That's an easy way for FDA to find something. I think something I found interesting recently was FDA's focus on clinicaltrials.gov reporting. And there's a lot of consideration sometimes for companies who maybe don't want to report because maybe they didn't get what they wanted, right? So the results aren't great, or there's some reason that they're keeping something back. And now the FDA is saying, no, you've got to report as necessary. There's a lot of tools that they have, there's forms you have to sign, and that could be misleading. It can ultimately become criminal, right? If you have to sign on a form and attest that you followed a process and you actually haven't, will it actually become criminal? I don't know, but you can see the slippery slope that comes with some of these non-reporting scenarios, and FDA is now focusing on it. I also think some of the audit considerations are interesting. Unannounced, really a foreign focus. And when you are working with foreign entities, you have to understand some of the risks you might be taking. There was a lot of consideration the last couple of years on foreign testing houses and some of the issues that FDA was finding there. And so that's not just like a new enforcement trend, but that's an increasing trend of making sure you understand who you're working with out in the space. And then real quick, a couple more thoughts on enforcement. It has come to our attention letters. They were rarely used for a long time. In the last couple of years, I have seen a lot of them. And what they are is a very easy enforcement light type tool. I call it enforcement light from an FDA perspective, because you can send it out and you can not put a ton of work in if you're FDA, but you can make a company do a whole lot of work, right? Whether you get a warning letter, an untitled letter, an ICTOA letter, as I call them, you're still going to respond in kind, 95% of the time. We had a question earlier asking, what if we don't respond? So it seems like a few of us may not respond, but ultimately, most of us are going to respond, and the resources and the person hours it takes to address all of that is really quite constraining. And so it's interesting to see FDA use that tool, because I think the amount of resources they pour in is limited, and the amount of resources industry has to put in to address it is great. So it's, be on the lookout, and if you get one, really take it seriously. And then, there's other areas of enforcement on medical device and pharma, and I don't know if, Rebecca, if there's anything kind of from a state scenario to look out for.
Yeah, I mean, some of the states, they require, certain drug or device companies to have licenses to sell in their states. And we recently saw Mississippi changed their definition of how they define medical device with regards to who requires a license in the state. So they essentially captured a much larger group of products and companies. And so just being on alert for these changes to know how you can comply is important.
Thank you. And I'm sure Vivian could speak to too. There's a lot of infrastructure that goes into states and medical device and durable medical equipment, and they need the funds to be able to run those programs. And the way they get funds is licensing and other things. And they're not getting funds through enforcement. So, it could always change that. If a state needs more funds, the way to get those funds is through licensure or other similar programs. Before we move on to the panel, a couple more thoughts. FDA programs to spur innovation. The first 10, 15 minutes, there's a little bit of maybe negative's the right word, but a little bit of there's some issues at FDA, and FDA acknowledges those issues, but there's also some unique opportunities at FDA, and it's always good to see what's out there. FDA's programs to spur innovation really are important to be aware of and to take action on if you can. Part of this is partnership with CMS, and that's really important, right? It's great to get a product to market quicker, but if no one's paying for it, what does that give you ultimately? So a thoughtful partnership with CMS to make sure that quicker paths to market also come with quicker reimbursement options. So the MPV, the Priority Voucher Program, which was the old commissioner's program, we'll see how that continues, but that was a unique idea to try to get review timelines on new drugs down significantly, as long as you had certain readiness in your program. And so that's a unique way to spur innovation. I know there was a little bit of controversy on how that was rolled out and who ultimately made the decisions for what was accepted, but it's certainly a bit of a template for other programs to say, okay, are there certain things that we can still get a full review, but do it in 10 months less, right? Because that's a lot of patients who could be helped in 10 months. The READY program, this is a unique program. It's actually recently rolled out. And it's about innovation in reducing hospitalizations. A lot of it is really focused on rural, but certainly you can see it would play out anywhere across the country. And it's, do you have something that deals with a chronic illness, something that when a patient is discharged and they go home, you've got an opportunity to get something in that home that can maybe reduce readministrations in the hospital, which are a great burden, a great expense. And so something there that FDA is just rolling out. I think they're actually accepting until September, they're accepting submissions on whether you could be accepted in it. So people out there with ideas, it would be a great time to think if that might fit. It kind of gives you a breakthrough type pathway right now, more touch points with FDA. And then the Tempo program it's a digital health focused program. This is really, a lot of the last couple are CDRH focused, a digital health program that's about chronic disease, and it's, ability to market your device without full pre-market authorization. And so there's some post-market requirements to make sure that you're meeting efficacy, safety considerations. I think this was March, some of the submissions were reviewed. And so, will be interesting to see what comes out of that. And then one that I like to point out is kind of a small change, a small pilot. It's a clarification on meeting minutes pilot, but I think it can be a huge of interest to industry to say, okay, I've got one more issue. Can I use this pilot program? Can I refer to this for FDA to kind of give me a follow-up and maybe save an additional pre-sub and maybe save 60, 75 days? I think that's a unique way of FDA saying, okay, can we limit it to one question or one kind of relatable question and maybe give a little bit more feedback to industry while not slowing them down too much. So real quick, looking ahead, I want to be done talking now. We're going to focus on my colleagues here. What do you see with FDA? What are you looking for from an FDA perspective, thinking about the things we've discussed here, some of the leadership changes, and kind of try to read the tea leaves if you can? Whomever.
I'll go first. I think with some of, there's been so many changes in the FDA, especially in the last couple of years. I think we're going to kind of hope for consistency. I know that there's been, I'm going to talk about it a little bit later too, but like with the QMSR rollout, there's a whole new inspection procedure that FDA inspectors are now following. I'm hoping that we're going to see consistency going forward, because that was a big program to roll out, and it's already, you know, there's already a little bit of anticipation around that and anxiety around that. So I just want to make sure that once we have these changes, or these changes with the FDA leadership, and as we go through those, I kind of hope they stick to some of the old programs and make sure that they keep those consistent.
To add on to that, I think that speed and innovation and public trust, I think those are some kind of tag words that were floating around in my head when I knew we were going to talk about kind of what's on the horizon for the FDA. And I think the FDA is charged with making these science-based decisions and balancing that, and, finding the right balance has always been a challenge. But I think particularly when there is this political pressure and, judicial review of decisions, I think that adds to the pressure. But I will also be hopeful, like Brynn, that we'll see a little less volatility.
I will agree with that, but I will also add, it's just so important to remain on alert. The ground is, shifting, and it can shift at any moment, especially for those who kind of operate in more regulatory gray areas. They need to be aware of any potential changes. I'll speak more about this soon, but I do expect us to see more enforcement and potentially some rulemaking on direct-to-consumer advertising. I think there is a lot of change that could still come.
Yeah, thank you. Great. So I got questions for you, and I think these are questions that really kind of set the stage of what we're talking about. So Brynn, the first one's up for you. How can companies leverage their experience under the quality system regulation to prepare for, but also importantly, succeed under the FDA's new quality management system regulation?
So I think a lot of the changes that came through, so QMSR is a big change. I was in my own home office, but I did let out a little audible gasp on February 2nd when I opened up the regulation and it was all gone. And I was like, oh, my old friend. But for folks that have worked in the industry for a while, folks that have worked at global manufacturing companies, ISO 1345 is very familiar to you. So I'm hoping that you can leverage any of your previous knowledge working with that standard, and even any of your previous knowledge kind of working with the old QSR regulation to kind of bring you forward into the new QMSR. A lot of the ideas and concepts are very similar, so it should be a fairly easy transition, even if you're not familiar with the 1345 standard. I think kind of like the biggest piece that I'm sort of looking forward to is the integration of more of the risk management piece within the quality system regulation. I know that can make some folks a little apprehensive just because it is now sprinkled throughout the entire regulation instead of kind of just hidden away there in that design validation piece. But I think it's a very welcome change, because I think historically the FDA was already kind of emphasizing risk management based approaches for everything. It just was not, it was not in the regulation as explicitly as it is now. So I think that will really help organizations as they move forward to kind of, keep that in the back of your mind. And if you're a person like me who kind of opens up that standard and opens up that regulation like most days of the week, you'll see that written out there. So it'll be a good reminder for folks just to kind of keep that in mind, because I know that as the FDA does kind of do additional enforcement, that is one thing that they are continuing to emphasize is risk management, along with kind of the other kind of main areas of focus. There hasn't been a real change that I've seen as far as with this QMSR transition, showing that the FDA is moving away from things like CAPA or from post-market surveillance. They're still emphasizing kind of the same things, and even with the new inspection methods, it's still kind of getting the same topics, same things are getting flagged. The one thing though I think manufacturers need to be aware of is, as we're kind of in the middle of this, a lot of these FDA inspections where now folks are getting warning letters, were done under the QSR. And so now the FDA though is expecting, when you're, if you're putting a CAPA in place, for example, to do some corrections based on that warning letter, that now needs to be under the QMSR. You can't rely on the old methods anymore. So I think that the industry does need to be aware of that going forward. or it'll be a little bit difficult to manage in the new landscape. So.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Brynn. Darya, how do you see FDA's approach to AI-enabled medical devices evolving, and how should companies be positioning themselves now?
So I come at this from obviously the regulatory group where we do submission work, we do post-market surveillance, and so I sort of think about AI, and I made a list of things, of issues that I foresee. And ultimately, I think because performance can evolve based on real-world use, I'm seeing more of a focus on devices that have AI capabilities of some kind. I'm seeing that there's a higher burden of post-market surveillance, post-market activities that are reportable to the FDA. So I think that the FDA is sort of shifting to like evaluating AI from a life cycle perspective rather than just kind of a static perspective. So that's one big shift. I think the key issue is really real world reliability, making sure that, when you test AI, in a perfect study setting, that's going to obviously yield certain results, but in real world, what will that look like? So I think that that's, one major aspect that we're seeing in submission world, but also post-market surveillance. AI is also kind of being treated more and more by the FDA as a part of, as part of the quality system. And so that's another consideration. Brynn, I'm sure you'll see a lot of that.
Very excited about that. Not my fault.
I figured this much. And then I think post-market monitoring just is we're going to see a drastic increase. So I think those are some of the kind of hot topics within AI. The static product aspect, I think, is changing. It's no longer, we're seeing these approvals or clearances on a static product or an algorithm. It's a living, breathing device now, and I think the FDA is trying to address that and evolve with it as AI kind of shifts the landscape. So.
Yeah, interesting, and it's great. Everyone wants to incorporate AI, and they've got to understand what that means.
For sure.
Another thing people love to incorporate is direct-to-consumer advertising, Rebecca. What do you think the future holds? And I know this might be really specific to pharma as well as the medical device.
Yeah, so we have continued to see a lot of enforcement in the direct-to-consumer advertising space. Since September 2025, when FDA issued a statement that they were going to be focusing on direct-to-consumer advertising, we have seen a surge of letters regarding that. Back in September, FDA also mentioned in that same statement that they had plans to initiate rulemaking to revise the adequate provision requirement, or they called loophole. Essentially, they want companies to include all of the risk information for a drug right there in the direct-to-consumer advertisement. Right now, they are able to just have a brief statement of the major risks. So while we haven't seen FDA initiate rulemaking in this area yet, they want to make clear that they have not forgotten about the direct-to-consumer advertisements, and we've seen a lot of letters focusing on a variety of issues in these ads. They can span from the proper balance of risk to benefit information, data portrayal, whether the risk information is adequate, all sorts of issues. People kind of joke about, sometimes they see drug commercials on TV and people are like, why are they singing and dancing while they're listing horrible side effects? And FDA is not immune to that. And so they are cracking down on some of these audio and visuals and, saying this could be misleading. And there was one letter I read where FDA noted that in several parts of the commercial, the product, which was a nasal spray, didn't have its cap. And part of the commercial was showing how easy it is to bring places. And FDA flagged that and said in the prescribing information, it says it needs to stay in the blister cap so it doesn't accidentally spray before the customer needs to use it. So they flagged that and said, you need to revise that. So they are looking, and they want people to be aware that this is still on their radar. I wanted to mention there's also been some talk within the last month from a couple of senators who are actually urging FDA to essentially require pre-review of direct-to-consumer drug TV advertisements before they air in order to kind of cure this viewing sort of enforcement. And this could be a possibility. I want to mention FDA does already have authority to implement rulemaking in this space. But that same statute also does at the same time limit their ability to compel the sponsor to actually adopt their changes that they recommend. So I think we'll have to see what happens in this space, but we should be aware that it is very much on FDA's radar.
Great reminder. Thank you. Clinical trials can make or break a company, make or break their future, right? They're extremely important. For Brynn, how can prior FDA clinical and regulatory experience inform a more efficient and compliant clinical trial strategy?
So this is kind of similar in the same vein as QMSR. There hasn't been like a big shift in the regulation or anything like that for clinical trials, but the FDA is continuing to focus on some of the same things that they are with QMSR compliance, mainly being that we are now, seeing a lot more global clinical trials. A lot of sponsors are using CROs. The FDA has been cracking down a little bit more on ensuring that sponsors aren't passing off their responsibility to that CRO, and that sponsors are bringing on that CRO, having appropriate supply agreements and oversight over that CRO. So the FDA still has been continuing to emphasize that sponsors do need to take responsibility for their contractors and everything like that. Same as any kind of manufacturer would need to take control of their suppliers as well. So there's also been a continuing emphasis with the FDA for clinical trials on risk. Again, it's similar to how they've been emphasizing that with QMSR compliance. They are looking to sponsors to make sure they're making risk-based decisions, making sure that they're doing their appropriate appropriate regulatory reporting for adverse events. That's another big one I'm seeing out of clinical trials that folks need to continue to watch out for. Should be doing already, but continuing to make sure that they're focusing on those areas.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Darya, I feel like cybersecurity is becoming like biocompatibility, where there's always going to be something. You think you have all your ducks in a row and you're missing 40 of them. So how is that changing FDA expectations, and what are companies still getting wrong when it comes to cybersecurity?
So I think that there's a lot of unpredictability around cybersecurity. I think that, a lot of the testing houses, there's been a lot of sort of unpredictability with what's expected from the FDA. So I think that there's probably more to come, because I'm seeing more and more clients having these issues about cybersecurity. But I think the biggest part to consider is that cybersecurity is really becoming a part of the safety and effectiveness of a device. Ultimately, it's not just a hacking incident or a data breach. A lot of times now it affects the functionality of a device, and so you can have situations where maybe a defibrillator doesn't defibrillate, and you can see how that can create safety issues for patients. So that's one aspect. I think the other aspect is, companies really need to start thinking about cybersecurity from the start. I think the FDA is getting very good at identifying when a company kind of considered cybersecurity as an afterthought and sort of layered and patched it on, instead of thinking about it from the start, before you even submit, when you submit and after you submit. So I think that that's another aspect. And then I think during the submission process, what I'm seeing is the FDA doesn't want to hear things like, oh, we're using, industry best practices here. They want to know in very real terms, what are you doing to mitigate risk? What are the risks that you see with your specific device, and how are you going to mitigate those? So,
yeah, no, great. Rebecca, I think GLP-1s are an interesting case study, right? Because of the just astronomical growth in the use of them, right? They're everywhere. They're not just the big prescriptions that you see on TV. A lot of compounding pharmacies are getting, involved with them. There's a lot of different ideas around products to help people find GLP-1s and all these things. How has FDA responded to this increase in GLP-1 use and just the fact that it's everywhere now in many different iterations?
Yeah, no, this is very, very prevalent right now. FDA is very much aware of what's going on in this space. So these GLP-1s, there are some that are FDA approved. Others are more operating in the compounding space because they were for a time on the national drug shortage list. So they had authority to be compounded for this mass use. Typically drugs are compounded, when there's a shortage, or if a patient has an individual need that the FDA approved version cannot take care of on its own. So there was a time where they were operating in this space. However, they are no longer on the national drug shortage list. But obviously there is still so much use of it right now. So FDA is operating in steps. So as of right now, FDA has been sending some letters to these telehealth companies, basically saying, a lot of your material is not okay. You're basically comparing your compounded drug to the FDA approved version, which is not okay. This comparative messaging essentially could mislead consumers into thinking that these compounded drugs are FDA approved when they're not. They haven't been tested for the same safety, effectiveness, and quality as an FDA approved drug would. So they're kind of coming at it from that angle. They're also sending some letters as well to the companies who have FDA approved drugs for claims about superiority and enhanced efficacy that just are not adequate, that are inadequately supported. So FDA is aware, and I believe they're going to just operate in strides and go about this a little bit slowly. But I guess we'll have to see what happens.
Yeah, thank you. That kind of goes to peptides in general, right? We could probably have another 30 minutes just on that and ways to navigate FDA. But I really appreciate your insight today and kind of what you've learned and where companies can go from here. I know we've got about a couple minutes left of our panel time, so if there are any questions, happy to address them.
Yeah, there's a couple online. First one is, so Rick Abramson joined the agency as the head of Digital Health Center of Excellence in February. Any potential impacts on that you've heard? He was most recently an exec at an AI imaging company.
Yeah, I was in a meeting with him a few weeks ago, actually, and right now he said he's in learning mode. So I think there's more to come. I think it's great that he's in learning mode because he brings experience from industry and he kind of brings experience of, okay, here's what my struggles have been. And when someone at the agency understands the struggles and they have now some power to impact those, how much from that position we'll see. But I think that that's great. So certainly more to come, but I really liked what I saw and I liked the way that he was approaching his initial time at the agency.
All right, this is probably for Brynn. Will FDA now recognize an ISO 13485 certificate?
I don't see that happening in the near future. They have very specifically said no right now. I think eventually that seems like the logical thing to do, but it does feel a little bit like that's kind of not the FDA's normal way that they operate, where there already is like the MDSAP program, and the FDA is still not kind of giving full reins to that either. So I don't see it, I guess, in the near future, but potentially someday.
All right, thank you all for your time.